1941. While a bloody war with Hitler's Germany rages on the western borders of the USSR, Japan's million-strong Kwantung Army is poised in the Far East, waiting for the right moment to strike. Only Soviet troops were holding back this threat, preventing the opening of a second front against the USSR. General Maksim Purkaev was the man entrusted with defending the Far Eastern borders. For 2.5 years, he prepared his troops for the decisive battle, turning the Far Eastern Front into a formidable force. In August 1945, the hour of reckoning arrived. The Sungari Operation was a triumph for the commander, who proved his skill. The story of the Far Eastern Guard, who protected the eastern borders of the motherland. If you are interested in the history of the Great Patriotic War and little-known commanders who made a huge contribution to the victory, subscribe to our channel and like this video. And in the comments, I suggest discussing: was it fair to remove Purkaev from command of the Sakhalin front for supply problems? Or was it an excessive measure that nearly ruined the career of a talented military leader? Share your opinion. On April 25, 1943, a sharp turn occurred in the career of Colonel General Maksim Alexeyevich Purkaev. Just 4 days earlier, he had been removed from command of the Sakhalin front, one of the key fronts in the fight against the German fascist invaders. The reason was not military failure, but problems with the organization of troop supplies, which led to tragic consequences. In the first quarter of 1943, due to poor organization of food supplies, there were 76 recorded cases of soldiers dying from exhaustion. For an experienced military leader who had risen from a simple soldier to front commander, this was a heavy blow. The Supreme Command Headquarters decided to replace him, and General Andrei Ivanovich Yeremenko took over the front from Purkaev. However, the Soviet military leadership was well aware of the value of Purkaev's experience and abilities. The country was fighting a war on two fronts, and while battles with Hitler's Germany were raging in the west, an equally formidable danger loomed in the east. Japan's million-strong Kwantung Army, deployed in Manchuria, posed a constant threat to the Soviet Union's Far Eastern borders. From the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, the USSR was forced to maintain a powerful military force of at least 40 divisions on its eastern borders. These troops could not be transferred to the west, despite the critical situation near Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. The Far Eastern Front needed an experienced, decisive commander who was capable not only of holding back the enemy, but also of preparing troops for future offensive operations. That is why the High Command chose Purkaev. He was appointed commander of the Far Eastern Front, one of the largest military formations of the Red Army. This appointment was not an honorary position, but a huge responsibility. Purkaev was to lead the forces that were supposed to hold back Japanese aggression and be ready for decisive action when the time came. In those years, the Far East was the theater of a special kind of war. A war without open battles, but with constant provocations, border violations, and tense military confrontation. The commander of the new front was well aware of the scale of the task. Japan, although bound by a neutrality pact with the USSR, continued to build up its military presence in Manchuria. The Japanese command developed the Kwantung Plan, an operation to invade Siberia and the Far East. Only the steadfastness of the Soviet troops and a show of force kept the Japanese from open aggression. In July to August 1941, the Kwantung Army conducted large-scale exercises, during which its strength was increased to 700,000 men. The command planned to begin the invasion of Primary in the second half of August of that year. The situation changed somewhat after Japan entered the war against Great Britain and the United States in December 1941. Tokyo chose a southern direction of expansion, attacking the American base at Pearl Harbor and beginning to seize the colonies of the Western powers in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. However, this did not mean that the threat to the USSR had been removed. On the contrary, the Japanese military leadership continued to view the Soviet Union as a potential enemy and coordinated its actions with Hitler's Germany. The goal was to tie down Soviet Far Eastern troops and prevent them from being transferred to the West. In a telegram to the Japanese government dated May 15, 1942, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop emphasized the effectiveness of Japan's policy of tying down Soviet troops. He noted that Russia was forced to keep significant forces in the Far East in anticipation of a Russian-Japanese confrontation. This strategy bore fruit, even during the most difficult period for the USSR. In the summer of 1942, the Japanese command transferred 2 additional tank divisions to Manchuria, which constituted half of all Japanese tank forces. Purkaev took command of the front under extremely difficult conditions. The troops were weakened by constant shipments of reinforcements to the west. The material base needed to be strengthened. It was necessary to study the theater of war, the deployment and condition of Japanese troops, and prepare plans for defensive and offensive operations. The general understood that he had a long and painstaking task ahead of him to transform the Far Eastern Front into a powerful fighting force capable of delivering a crushing blow to the enemy. At the end of 1943, the Supreme Command Headquarters set the Front Command a specific task: to study the deployment and condition of the Japanese Kwantung Army and to develop plans for future operations. This work was carried out in the strictest secrecy. Reconnaissance units gathered information about Japanese fortifications, troop strength, armaments, and command plans. Staff officers worked out options for offensive operations, taking into account the complex geography of the region: mountain ranges, rivers, swamps, and taiga. Purkaev personally delved into all the details of the preparations. He understood that the war in the Far East, when it began, would require completely different approaches than the battles in the European theater. Here, it would be necessary to operate over vast distances in specific climatic and landscape conditions against an enemy with powerful fortified areas and considerable combat experience. The general knew that his troops had to be ready for a lightning offensive capable of breaking the Japanese resistance before they could organize an echelon defense. But until that moment, there were many long months of tense anticipation and careful preparation. Would Purkaev be able to justify the trust placed in him by the High Command and turn his front into a force capable of defeating the Kwantung Army? The story of Maksim Alexeyevich Purkaev began far from military headquarters and battlefields. On August 13th, according to the old calendar, or August 25th, according to the new calendar, in 1894, a boy was born in the village of Nalito, in the Simbirsk province, to the family of a simple peasant carpenter, Alexei Purkaev. The village was located deep in the Russian province, where life flowed steadily and unhurriedly, following the rhythms of rural labor and peasant life. The family was not wealthy. The father earned a living as a carpenter, and the mother ran the household. In those days, the path to becoming a general seemed like an incredible fantasy for a peasant's son. Maksim's childhood was spent in a typical late 19th century Russian village setting. Hard work from an early age, a modest lifestyle, but at the same time strong family traditions and that special village way of life that shaped his character. The boy grew up strong, quick-witted, and hard-working. He helped his father with carpentry, learned to work with his hands, understand materials, and see things through to the end. These qualities, perseverance, attention to detail, and the ability to plan work, would later serve him well in military affairs. Education in rural areas was not available to everyone, but Maksim managed to finish elementary school. For a peasant's son, this was already an achievement. However, further education remained out of reach. The family could not afford to send their son to the city to continue his studies. The young man worked alongside his father, learning carpentry and helping his family. It seemed that his fate was predetermined. He would become a rural craftsman like his father, live his life in his native village, start a family, and run a farm. But history had other plans. In September 1915, when the Russian Empire was already in its second year of bloody war with Germany and Austria-Hungary, 20-year-old Maksim Purkaev made a decision that changed his entire life. He volunteered for the Russian Imperial Army. It was a conscious choice of a patriot ready to defend his homeland in a time of need. Many of his peers had already been called up for mobilization. The front needed more and more soldiers, and Maksim did not want to stand aside. He was assigned to the 94th Reserve Regiment, where recruits were trained before being sent to the front. Military service in the Tsarist army was harsh. Strict discipline, grueling training, and difficult living conditions. But for a peasant boy accustomed to physical labor, this was not an insurmountable challenge. Purkaev quickly mastered military skills and proved himself to be a disciplined and efficient soldier. He was noticed by his commanders. The young soldier stood out among his comrades for his quick wit and responsible attitude toward service. The First World War became a real school of life for Maksim Alexievich. He experienced the hardships of trench life, participated in battles, saw the death of his comrades, and learned to survive in conditions where every day could be his last. The war of that era was particularly brutal. Positional battles with hours of artillery shelling, bayonet attacks, and enemy gas attacks. Soldier Purkaev faced death many times, but fate spared him. He gained invaluable combat experience, learned to understand the psychology of a soldier, and saw examples of both good and bad leadership. By the end of the war, a crisis was brewing in the Russian army. Prolonged fighting, huge losses, supply problems, and the people's weariness with the war all undermined the combat effectiveness and discipline of the troops. In February 1917, a revolution took place in Russia, overthrowing the monarchy. The army began to disintegrate, soldiers deserted en masse, refused to obey their officers, and demanded an end to the war. Purkaev witnessed the collapse of the once powerful military machine. The events of the October Revolution of 1917 and the Civil War that followed forced everyone to choose which side to fight on. For Purkaev, the choice was obvious. The son of a peasant, he saw in the Bolsheviks a force that promised land to the peasants and a just social order. In 1918, Maksim Alexievich joined the Red Army, which was just being formed and desperately needed people with combat experience. The Civil War was even more brutal than the World War. Brother fought against brother, and the outcome of battles was often decided not so much by military skill as by the ideological conviction and morale of the fighters. Purkaev fought on several fronts: the eastern, southern, and western. He started as a rifle company commander and then rose to the rank of battalion commander. In battles against the White Army, interventionists and nationalists, his leadership qualities became apparent: the ability to organize people, make quick decisions in critical situations, and personal bravery. The Civil War ended with the victory of the Reds, and the country was faced with the task of peaceful construction. But for a professional soldier like Purkaev, service continued. The Red Army needed educated commanders who could master modern military science and prepare troops for future battles. Purkaev understood that without systematic education, further growth was impossible. In 1923, he graduated from the Vystrel courses, one of the Red Army's leading educational institutions, which trained mid-level commanders. This was only the first step in his military education. Purkaev proved to be a capable student, easily absorbing theoretical knowledge and knowing how to apply it in practice. His career slowly but surely progressed. Service in various military districts, command of units at different levels, participation in exercises, all this shaped the former peasant boy into a professional military leader. But the most serious trials were yet to come. What twists of fate awaited Purkaev on his way to becoming a general? The First World War was a harsh school for soldier Maksim Purkaev, where the price of mistakes was measured in human lives. After completing his training in the 94th Reserve Regiment, he was sent to the front. The eastern front of the Russian Empire stretched for thousands of kilometers, from the Baltic Sea to the Romanian border. Here, the Russian army faced the combined forces of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The fighting was mixed. Periods of successful offensives were followed by heavy retreats. Young soldier Purkaev ended up in an infantry unit that held positions on one section of the front. Life in the trenches was grueling. Damp, cold, lice, scarce food, constant danger. Artillery shelling could begin at any moment, turning the trench section into hell. Shells exploded, filling the trenches with earth, creating craters, maiming and killing people. It was necessary to keep a cool head, follow orders, and support comrades. Purkaev quickly understood the main rule of life at the front. Those who can think quickly, work in a team, and keep their cool in critical moments survive. The attacks were especially terrifying. When the whistle blew and chains of infantrymen rose from the trenches, hell began. Enemy machine gun fire mowed down the advancing troops. Artillery pounded the attacking chains, but the order was to keep moving forward. Soldiers ran through craters and barbed wire, fell, jumped up, striving to reach enemy positions. Those who broke through to the enemy trenches engaged in hand-to-hand combat, bayonet fights, where the stronger, more agile, and more determined won. Purkaev participated in such attacks and defended his positions from enemy assaults. Each time, it was a test not only of physical strength, but also of strength of spirit. The war taught him to value the lives of his comrades and understand the importance of mutual assistance. In the trenches, special bonds formed between soldiers, a frontline brotherhood where everyone was ready to cover each other's backs. Purkaev earned the respect of his comrades with his reliability and calmness under fire. His commanders noted his bravery and diligence. Gradually, he was promoted to junior commander, responsible for a small group of soldiers. This was the first step in his command career. By the end of the war, the Russian army was in a state of deep crisis. The revolution of 1917 destroyed army discipline. Soldiers formed councils that often did not obey their officers. The front was falling apart, and troops were deserting en masse. Purkaev saw once combat-ready units turn into uncontrollable mobs. The provisional government tried to continue the war, but the army no longer wanted to fight. The Brest Peace of 1918 formally ended Russia's participation in the World War. But a new nightmare began for the country: the Civil War. Joining the Red Army was a natural choice for Purkaev. He saw in the Bolsheviks a force capable of ending the chaos and creating a new state. The Red Army was just being formed in 1918. It was a young army, created on the principles of voluntarism and ideological conviction. Some of the old career officers of the Tsarist army went over to the Reds, while others fought in the White armies or emigrated. Command positions were often filled by people without special military training, but who were devoted to revolutionary ideals. Purkaev, who had frontline experience in World War I, was immediately given a command position. He was appointed commander of a rifle company. The Civil War differed from the positional battles of the World War. The fronts were mobile, units made long marches, and fought maneuver battles. The morale of the troops, the quality of command, and supplies were of decisive importance. The Red Army fought simultaneously on several fronts, against the White Guard armies of Kolchak, Denikin, Yudenich, and Wrangel, against Polish troops, and against nationalist formations on the outskirts of the former empire. Purkaev participated in battles on the Eastern Front against Kolchak's armies, on the Southern Front against Denikin, and on the Western Front in the war with Poland. Commanding a company required not only personal bravery, but also organizational skills. It was necessary to train soldiers, many of whom had never held a weapon before, maintain discipline, ensure supplies, and plan the unit's combat operations. Purkaev proved himself to be a capable commander. His company participated in many battles, accomplished its tasks, and suffered relatively few losses thanks to competent management. This did not go unnoticed. He was soon promoted to battalion commander. Commanding a battalion is a serious level of responsibility. A battalion commander has several hundred soldiers, several companies, and machine gun teams at his disposal. The battalion could independently solve tactical tasks in its sector of the front. Purkaev successfully coped with this role. He demonstrated not only bravery, but also tactical thinking, the ability to assess the situation, choose the right decision, and organize the interaction of units. The future commander was formed in the battles of the Civil War. The Civil War ended in 1920 with a complete victory for the Reds. The White armies were defeated, the interventionists were withdrawn, and the national peripheries were returned to the control of the central government. The country lay in ruins. Industry was destroyed, agriculture was undermined, millions were dead, and millions were refugees and emigrants. But for the Soviet government, peace had come. The Red Army, created in the crucible of the Civil War, needed to be reorganized and professionalized. Self-taught commanders had to receive systematic military education. By this time, Purkaev had extensive combat experience. 6 years of war, from private to battalion commander. But he understood the need for theoretical knowledge for further growth. In 1923, he enrolled in the Vystrel Command Staff training courses located near Moscow. These courses trained mid-level commanders, providing in-depth knowledge of tactics, military history, and troop organization. The training required complete dedication, but Purkaev successfully completed the program. Graduating from Vystrel opened the way to higher positions. But could he have imagined then that in 20 years he would be commanding an entire front? The 1920s were a period of intense professional growth for Maksim Alexievich Purkaev. After graduating from Vystrel in 1923, new career opportunities opened up for him. The Red Army was transitioning from a revolutionary militia to a regular professional army. It needed educated commanders who could assimilate the achievements of global military thought and apply them in the context of Soviet military doctrine. Purkaev was appointed to command positions in various military units, where he continued to hone his skills. Service in peacetime had its own specifics. It was necessary to train young conscripts, conduct exercises, maintain combat readiness, and study new techniques. The Red Army was gradually rearming and receiving modern weapons. Tanks appeared, aviation developed, and artillery was modernized. Commanders had to master new types of weapons and methods of their use. Purkaev closely followed military innovations, studied the experience of foreign armies, and read military literature. An important milestone was his training in 1931 at advanced courses for senior commanders. This was a higher level of military education designed to train commanders of large units and staff officers. The program included the study of operational art, strategy, troop management, and staff work. Purkaev showed excellent results, demonstrating his ability to think big and plan operations at the Army and front levels. The highest achievement of the pre-war period was his graduation in 1936 from the Frunze Military Academy, the main higher military educational institution of the Red Army. The academy trained the military elite, commanders, and top staff officers. The training there was intensive and complex, requiring deep immersion in military science. Students studied the history of wars, the theory of operational art, the tactics of all branches of the armed forces, issues of material and technical support, and troop management. Much attention was paid to staff work, planning operations, organizing communications and intelligence, and logistics. Graduating from the Frunze Academy opened the way to senior command positions. Purkaev was assigned to the headquarters of a military district, where he was involved in planning combat training, developing operational plans, and organizing exercises. Staff work required different qualities than commanding troops. Here, the main thing was the ability to analyze information, calculate options, coordinate the actions of various services and units, and document decisions. Purkaev proved himself to be a highly qualified staff officer. The 1930s were a difficult time for the Red Army. The mass repressions of 1937-1938 hit the command staff hard. Thousands of experienced commanders were arrested and shot on charges of espionage, conspiracy, and sabotage. The army lost its best military leaders. Marshal Tukhachevsky, military district commanders, corps and division commanders, staff officers, the repressions wiped out an entire layer of military professionals. A personnel shortage arose, and less experienced officers were hastily promoted to fill the vacant positions. Purkaev managed to avoid repression, although many of his colleagues were arrested. He continued his service, receiving increasingly responsible assignments. In the context of a personnel shortage, his experience and education were particularly valuable. By the end of the 1930s, he held high positions in the staff structures, participated in the planning of large-scale exercises, and developed operational plans for the defense of the western borders of the USSR. The military-political situation was becoming increasingly tense. In 1939, events unfolded that revealed the weaknesses of the Red Army after the repressions. The Soviet-Finnish War, which began in November, exposed serious problems in the management of troops, supply, and coordination between different branches of the military. Despite its multiple superiority in forces, the Red Army suffered heavy losses while breaking through Mannerheim's fortified line. The war ended in March 1940 with the victory of the USSR, but the price was high. The military leadership drew conclusions, adjusted the training of troops, and improved the organization. At the same time, a serious military conflict with Japan broke out in the Far East. In the summer of 1939, Japanese troops invaded the territory of the Mongolian People's Republic in the area of the Khalkhin-Gol River. The USSR, bound by a mutual assistance treaty with Mongolia, sent its troops. Under the command of Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, Soviet troops inflicted a crushing defeat on the Japanese. The Khalkhin-Gol Operation became a model for the use of massive tank strikes and air support. Japan was forced to agree to a truce. The success at Khalkhin-Gol was of strategic importance. Japan abandoned its immediate aggression against the USSR and focused on expansion in the south. This allowed the Soviet leadership to focus its attention on the West, where the threat from Nazi Germany was becoming increasingly real. In August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, ensuring temporary security in the West. But experienced military leaders understood that war with Germany was inevitable. It was only a matter of time. In 1940, Purkaev was appointed Chief of Staff of the Kiev Special Military District, one of the largest and most important military districts covering the western border. The commander of the district was Army General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, the future Marshal and Chief Commander of the Great Patriotic War. The work of the Chief of Staff of such a district required enormous effort. It was necessary to organize combat training for the troops, monitor their material support, develop plans of action in case of war, and coordinate the work of numerous headquarters services. In the spring of 1941, Soviet intelligence reported the concentration of German troops near the western borders of the USSR. Signs of an impending attack were multiplying, but the top political leadership refused to believe that war would break out soon. Stalin was afraid of provoking Hitler with premature measures to strengthen defenses. The troops in the border districts were in a state of uncertainty, preparing for war, but not giving cause for accusations of aggressive intentions. In this difficult situation, staff officers did everything possible to increase combat readiness, but bound by directives from above, they could not deploy troops to their full extent. June 22, 1941, was approaching, a day that would change the fate of millions of people and the entire country. How would Major General Purkaev, Chief of Staff of the Kiev Special Military District, respond to the war? The night of June 22, 1941, became fateful for millions of people. At 3:30 a.m. Moscow time, German troops began their invasion of the Soviet Union without a declaration of war. Massive airstrikes were launched on Soviet airfields, artillery opened fire on border fortifications, and Wehrmacht tank and infantry divisions crossed the border along a vast stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Great Patriotic War, the most terrible and bloody war in human history, had begun. Major General Maksim Alexeyevich Purkaev, Chief of Staff of the Kiev Special Military District, was one of the first senior commanders to learn of the outbreak of war. The first reports from the border poured into the district headquarters. German aircraft were bombing cities and military facilities, artillery was firing on positions, and German troops were crossing border rivers. The situation was chaotic, with information coming in piecemeal and often contradictory. Many communication nodes were destroyed in the first strikes, and communication with the units was interrupted. Purkaev immediately reported to the district commander, Army General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, who was in Moscow at the time as Chief of the General Staff of the Red Army. According to some sources, it was Purkaev who first informed Zhukov of the German attack, which allowed the top military leadership to immediately begin mobilization and issue the first orders to the troops. Those first minutes and hours of the war were critically important. The fate of the armies and fronts depended on the speed of the response. The Kiev Special Military District, renamed the Southwestern Front at the start of the war, covered a crucial strategic direction. Ukraine was home to the largest industrial areas, the breadbasket of the country, and the routes to Moscow from the south ran through Ukrainian territory. The German command planned a powerful strike by Army Group South with the aim of encircling and destroying Soviet troops on the right bank of Ukraine, capturing Kiev and continuing eastward. The troops of the Southwestern Front were supposed to counter this strike. As Chief of Staff, Purkaev was responsible for organizing the command of the troops in these critical conditions. It was necessary to restore broken communications with the units, assess the situation along the entire front, organize resistance to the advancing enemy, and coordinate the actions of the front's armies. The task was complicated by the fact that many units had not been fully mobilized, had not taken up their pre-prepared defensive positions, and were scattered across their permanent locations. The suddenness of the attack deprived the Soviet command of the opportunity to meet the enemy in full combat readiness. The first days of the war showed how difficult the confrontation would be. German troops, with 2 years of experience in Europe, well-coordinated interaction between branches of the military, modern technology, and a clear command system, delivered powerful blows. Soviet troops fought heroically, but the imbalance of forces, the suddenness of the attack, and problems with command and supply led to heavy losses. German tank groups broke through the defenses and rushed deep into Soviet territory, surrounding entire armies. The headquarters of the Southwestern Front worked under extreme pressure. Purkaev and his subordinate staff officers worked day and night processing reports, issuing orders to troops, and coordinating actions with neighboring fronts and the general staff. The situation was changing rapidly, and plans had to be adjusted several times a day. Retreats were followed by counterattacks, which rarely led to success due to the enemy's superiority in the air and on the ground. Soviet aviation suffered enormous losses, with many aircraft destroyed at airfields in the first hours of the war. One of the most dramatic episodes of the early period of the war was the battle for Kiev in the summer and fall of 1941. The German command attached great importance to the capture of the Ukrainian capital. Several times, German troops tried to break through to the city, but met with stubborn resistance. The troops of the Southwestern Front fought with great courage, dealing significant blows to the enemy. However, the strategic situation was deteriorating. German tank groups were encircling the Kiev group from the north and south, creating the threat of encirclement. Purkaev saw the impending disaster and participated in attempts to convince the High Command to allow the withdrawal of troops from under the threat of encirclement. But the Supreme Command headquarters categorically forbade the abandonment of Kiev. Stalin personally insisted on holding the city at any cost. As a result, in September 1941, the Kiev disaster occurred. The troops of the Southwestern Front were surrounded. More than 600,000 Soviet soldiers and officers were killed or taken prisoner. It was one of the greatest military disasters in history. Purkaev was not surrounded. By that time, he had already received a new assignment. His experience and professionalism were in demand on other sections of the front. The tragedy of the Kiev Cauldron was a hard lesson for all Soviet commanders, showing the price of wrong strategic decisions and underestimating the enemy. But the war was just beginning, and both heavy defeats and great victories lay ahead. From November 1941, Purkaev commanded the 60th Reserve Army, which was renamed the 3rd Shock Army in December. The High Command entrusted him with two crucial tasks. The first was to prepare for the transfer of 7 divisions of the 60th Reserve Army to the Gorky defensive line in the rear of the Moscow defense zone. This line was to be the last line of defense in case the Germans broke through to Moscow. The second task was no less important, commanding the military parade on November 7, 1941, in Kuybyshev. This parade was of enormous political and propaganda significance. Foreign diplomatic missions and government agencies were evacuated to Kuybyshev, and the city became the backup capital in case Moscow fell. It was necessary to demonstrate to the whole world, allies and potential enemies, that the Soviet Union was continuing to fight. Its army was combat-ready, and the country was not broken. Purkaev brilliantly managed the organization of the parade. The solemn procession of troops and the flyover of aircraft in front of the diplomats made the desired impression. The USSR demonstrated its strength and determination to continue the war until victory. What would be the general's future fate on the battlefields of the Great Patriotic War? December 1941 was a turning point in the war. The German offensive on Moscow faltered, exhausted by continuous fighting and depleted in battles with stubbornly resisting Soviet troops. German divisions stopped a few dozen kilometers from the capital. Hitler's plan for a lightning war had failed. The Soviet command was preparing a counteroffensive that would drive the enemy away from Moscow and dispel the myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility. The 3rd Shock Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Maksim Purkaev, was brought into battle northwest of Moscow. The army's task was to advance in the strip between Lake Seliger and the city of Ostashkov, break through the enemy's defenses, and advance westward to encircle and destroy the German troops. It was one of several shock armies created specifically for offensive operations. The troops were reinforced with artillery and tanks and were replenished with personnel. On December 5th, the Soviet counteroffensive began near Moscow. Across the entire front, the Red Army went on the attack, driving the enemy from their positions. The psychological effect was enormous. German soldiers, who had been advancing deep into Soviet territory for months, were forced to retreat for the first time. The 3rd Shock Army entered the battle in mid-December. The offensive was conducted in difficult winter conditions. Temperatures reached 30 to 40 degrees below zero. Snowstorms hampered movement, and roads were covered with snow. Purkaev's troops attacked the fortified positions of the German 16th Army. The Germans resisted stubbornly, clinging to every settlement and counterattacking with tanks and infantry. However, the Soviet soldiers, inspired by the initial successes of the counteroffensive, fought with unprecedented tenacity. Village after village changed hands. Artillery destroyed German fortifications, infantry broke into enemy trenches, and fierce hand-to-hand combat ensued. Tanks supported the advancing units, suppressed firing points, and shot at columns of retreating enemies. By the end of December, the troops of the Third Shock Army had advanced 30 to 40 kilometers, liberated several settlements, and inflicted significant losses on the enemy. However, the pace of the offensive slowed. The German command transferred reserves, strengthened defenses, and organized counterattacks. Soviet troops suffered heavy losses and experienced supply difficulties. The roads were almost impassable in winter conditions, and the delivery of ammunition and food was delayed. In addition, the army was operating in difficult terrain, abundant with forests and swamps. In January 1942, the offensive continued. The Supreme Command set the task of building on their success, surrounding and destroying enemy groups, and preventing the Germans from establishing defensive lines. The Third Shock Army participated in the Toropets-Kulm Operation, one of the components of the Red Army's General Winter Offensive. The aim of the operation was to defeat German troops in the Toropets and Kulm area and disrupt communications between Army Groups Center and North. On January 9th, a new stage of the offensive began. Purkaev's troops broke through the enemy's defenses and rushed forward. In a few days, Soviet units advanced 100 kilometers and liberated the city of Toropets, an important railway junction and supply base for German troops. The capture of Toropets was of great importance. It disrupted enemy communications and created the threat of encircling the German group in the Demyansk area. The troops continued their offensive, advancing into the rear of the Demyansk group. By the end of January and beginning of February, more than 100,000 German soldiers were surrounded in the so-called Demyansk Cauldron. The Soviet command planned to destroy this group, as it had later succeeded in doing at Stalingrad. The Third Shock Army fought to tighten the encirclement and repelled the enemy's attempts to break through. However, the German command organized air supplies to the encircled troops and prepared a relief strike from outside. In April, the Germans managed to break through a corridor to the encircled group and restore land communications. The Demyansk operation continued with varying success until the end of February 1943. Purkaev's troops participated in these protracted battles, exhausting the enemy and inflicting losses on them. Although the Demyansk group was not completely destroyed, the operation tied up significant Wehrmacht forces, preventing them from being transferred to other sections of the front. The Germans were forced to keep several divisions here that could have reinforced the offensive in other directions. The command of the Third Shock Army demonstrated Purkaev's abilities as a military leader who knew how to organize an offensive operation and command troops in the difficult conditions of winter combat. He gained combat experience commanding a large unit in modern warfare, with the massive use of artillery, tanks, and aviation. This was a completely different level of responsibility than commanding a company or battalion in the Civil War. Purkaev was awarded orders for his successful leadership of the troops. In August 1942, Lieutenant General Purkaev received a new, even more responsible appointment, commander of the Kalinin Front. This was a promotion to the highest level of the military hierarchy. The front commander leads several armies, is responsible for defense or offense in a strategically important direction, interacts with neighboring fronts, and reports directly to the Supreme Command headquarters. The appointment to this position was evidence of the top leadership's trust in Purkaev. The Kalinin Front covered the northwestern approaches to Moscow. After the winter offensive of 1941-1942, the front line ran west of Kalinin, and a German defensive salient formed in the Rzhev area, extending deep into Soviet territory. The Rzhev salient posed a constant threat to Moscow. From here, the Germans could strike the capital. Eliminating this salient was a crucial strategic task. However, the Germans had turned Rzhev into a powerful fortified area, saturated with troops and equipment. Purkaev was to lead the troops in one of the bloodiest and most protracted battles of the Great Patriotic War. The fighting for Rzhev would last more than a year, claim hundreds of thousands of lives, and go down in history as the Rzhev meat grinder. The front commander would face the most difficult test, leading troops in conditions of extremely intense positional warfare, where every kilometer of advance cost thousands of soldiers' lives. Would the general be able to justify the trust placed in him and achieve a breakthrough in this exhausting struggle? The Kalinin Front, commanded by Lieutenant General Maksim Alexievich Purkaev, since August 1942, occupied one of the most important sectors of the Soviet-German front. The line of defense stretched for hundreds of kilometers west of Kalinin, covering the Rzhev salient, a powerful fortified area that the Germans had turned into an impregnable fortress. The German command attached great importance to holding Rzhev, seeing it as a springboard for a future offensive on Moscow or a base for defense against Soviet attacks. The Rzhev-Vyazma salient was created by the Germans after their retreat in the winter of 1941-1942. Large forces of Army Group Center were concentrated here. Several dozen divisions, including tank and motorized units. German engineers created a deeply echeloned defense with numerous pillboxes, dugouts, trenches, and minefields. Every village was turned into a strong point. Artillery was positioned on commanding heights, providing fire cover for the entire defense. The first major operation under Purkaev's command was the Rzhev-Siekevskaya Offensive, which began on July 30, 1942. At the same time, troops of the Western Front, under the command of General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, advanced. The plan of the operation was to break through the enemy's defenses, encircle and destroy the German forces in Rzhev. The Soviet command concentrated a powerful group of troops, including tank corps, artillery, and aviation, in the direction of the main strike. The offensive began after a massive artillery barrage. Thousands of guns rained fire on German positions. However, the enemy was ready for the offensive and met the attackers with heavy fire. The German defenses proved to be stronger than expected. Minefields delayed the tanks. Anti-tank artillery shot down the vehicles that broke through, and machine guns mowed down the advancing infantry. Soviet troops suffered huge losses, but continued their attacks. Day after day, units stormed German positions, winning back meters and kilometers. In 2.5 months of fighting, the troops of the Kalinin and Western fronts advanced 30 to 40 kilometers and liberated several settlements, but they failed to encircle and destroy the Rzhev group. The Germans held out stubbornly, transferring reserves and launching counterattacks. On August 23rd, the operation was halted. Soviet losses were extremely high, tens of thousands killed and wounded. It was one of the bloodiest operations of the summer of 1942. In the fall of 1942, the High Command prepared a new major operation against the Rzhev salient. The operation was codenamed Mars and was to be part of an overall strategic plan that also included Operation Uranus near Stalingrad. The plan called for a simultaneous offensive by the Kalinin and Western fronts, with the aim of encircling and destroying the German Ninth Army in the Rzhev area. If the operation had succeeded, it would have been the Red Army's greatest victory on the central section of the front. The offensive began on November 25th. The Kalinin Front troops under the command of Purkaev attacked in several directions, trying to break through the German defenses and get behind the enemy. 3 armies, reinforced by tank and mechanized corps, were operating in the direction of the main strike. The artillery preparation lasted several hours. When the infantry and tanks went on the attack, a bloody battle began. The German defenses again proved to be stronger than expected. Reconnaissance underestimated the strength of the enemy and failed to identify all firing points and reserves. The German command figured out the Soviet plan in time and prepared to repel the offensive. Counterattacks followed one after another. German tanks and assault guns struck the Soviet units that had broken through. The Air Force bombed troop concentrations and tank columns. In some places, Soviet troops broke through the first line of defense and advanced several kilometers, but they were unable to build on their success. Operation Mars continued until December 20th and ended in failure. The troops of the Kalinin and Western fronts were unable to encircle the enemy and suffered heavy losses. 100,000 killed and wounded, hundreds of tanks, guns, and aircraft. It was one of the bloodiest defeats of the Red Army, which for many years people tried not to remember. Against the backdrop of the triumphant victory at Stalingrad, where Paulus's 300,000-strong army was surrounded and destroyed, the failure at Rzhev looked particularly painful. However, the High Command did not give up on its attempts to eliminate the Rzhev salient. In the winter of 1942-1943, a new operation was prepared. The Velikiye Luki offensive began in November 1942 and continued until January 1943. The troops of the Kalinin Front, under the command of Purkaev, attacked in the area of the city of Velikiye Luki, seeking to encircle and destroy the German garrison. After fierce fighting, the city was taken and the German group was defeated. It was a success, albeit one achieved at a high price. In March 1943, an event took place that the Soviet command had been striving for more than a year. The Germans left Rzhev. The German command decided to straighten the front line and withdraw its troops to pre-prepared defensive positions. On March 31st, troops from the Kalinin and Western fronts carried out the Rzhev-Vyazma operation, during which they liberated Rzhev and Vyazma and advanced 130-160 kilometers. The immediate threat to Moscow from the west was eliminated. It seemed that Purkaev could be satisfied with the results. The front under his command had accomplished its strategic task, and the Rzhev salient had been eliminated. However, alarming signals were coming from the rear services. The system of supplying the troops was functioning intermittently. Soldiers were not receiving enough food, medical care was inadequate, and hygiene conditions were not being observed. In the first quarter of 1943, military medics recorded 76 cases of soldiers dying from exhaustion and related illnesses. For the Supreme Command headquarters, this was unacceptable. The The Red Army suffered huge losses in battle, but the death of soldiers from starvation behind the front lines was considered criminal negligence. The front commander was responsible not only for combat operations, but also for supplying the troops. On April 21, 1943, Purkaev was removed from command of the Kalinin Front. On April 29th, Army General Andrei Ivanovich Yeremenko took command of the front. This was a heavy blow for Purkaev. Being removed from command in the midst of war was perceived as a personal catastrophe. But the High Command found a new use for him, one that required his experience and abilities. What awaited the general in his new assignment? While grandiose battles of the Great Patriotic War were unfolding in the West, the situation on the eastern borders of the Soviet Union remained tense. The Far East remained a potential theater of war throughout the entire war. Japan, a militaristic empire with aggressive ambitions, had a powerful Kwantung Army in Manchuria and Korea, aimed at Soviet territory. The Soviet leadership could not ignore this threat and was forced to maintain significant military forces in the Far East. On April 13, 1941, the USSR and Japan signed a 5-year neutrality pact. This agreement temporarily diffused the confrontation and allowed the Soviet leadership to transfer some of its Far Eastern divisions to the West to defend Moscow. However, the Japanese government viewed the pact as a tactical maneuver, without abandoning its strategic plans for expansion to the north. Tokyo closely monitored developments on the Soviet-German front, ready to enter the war against the USSR in the event of serious successes by the Wehrmacht. In the summer of 1941, when German troops were rapidly advancing deep into Soviet territory, a debate unfolded in Japan about the advisability of attacking the USSR. The military leadership was divided into two camps. Some advocated the northern option, an attack on the Soviet Far East and Siberia with the aim of capturing resource-rich territories. Others insisted on the southern option, expansion into Southeast Asia, the capture of European colonies, and the establishment of control over the Pacific Ocean. In July 1941, the Japanese command conducted large-scale military exercises under the code name Kantoku-en, Special Maneuvers of the Kwantung Army. Under the cover of the exercises, a secret mobilization began. The Kwantung Army was increased to 700,000–800,000 men. Divisions were transferred from Japan and Korea to Manchuria. Plans were made to invade Primary and Transbaikalia. The strike was planned for the second half of August, when the collapse of the Red Army under the blows of the Wehrmacht would become apparent. However, the Soviet troops did not collapse. Despite the heavy defeats of the summer and autumn of 1941, the front was not broken. The army remained combat-ready, and resistance grew stronger. The Battle of Moscow in the autumn of 1941 showed that the Blitzkrieg had failed, and Germany was bogged down in a protracted war. The Japanese command decided to postpone the attack on the USSR and focus on the southern direction. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, starting a war with the United States and Great Britain. Japan's entry into the war in the Pacific did not remove the threat to the Far East of the USSR. Moreover, Tokyo continued to consider war with the Soviet Union a likely prospect. The Kwantung Army not only did not shrink, but at times grew stronger. The Japanese command coordinated its actions with Germany, and both sides planned to meet their troops somewhere in Siberia after the defeat of the USSR. German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop repeatedly called on the Japanese to increase pressure on the Soviet Far Eastern borders In order to prevent the transfer of troops to the West, Soviet intelligence closely monitored the actions of the Japanese. A network of agents in Manchuria and Japan reported on troop movements, the construction of fortifications, and military exercises. Border guards recorded provocations and border violations. Aerial reconnaissance monitored Japanese military facilities. All this information was sent to the headquarters of the military districts and fronts of the Far East, analyzed and used to plan defensive and offensive actions. The Far Eastern Front, formed at the beginning of the war on the basis of the Far Eastern Military District, covered a huge territory, from Transbaikalia to the Pacific Ocean. The front headquarters was located in Khabarovsk. The front consisted of several combined arms armies, tank and mechanized units, aviation formations, and fortified areas. The troops were spread out along a 1,000-kilometer border, covering the most likely directions of a Japanese invasion. A distinctive feature of the Far Eastern theater of war was its remoteness from the industrial centers of the European part of the USSR. Troops were supplied via the Trans-Siberian Railway, the only railway artery connecting the Far East with the center of the country. The capacity of this road was limited, which created problems with the delivery of weapons, ammunition, food, and reinforcements. Local industry was underdeveloped and could not meet all the needs of the troops. Climatic and geographical conditions also had an impact on military training. The Sakhalin Island mountain ranges, the Greater Khingan, numerous rivers, the Amur, Ussuri, and Sungari, vast swampy lowlands, and taiga, all required special training for the troops. Soldiers learned to operate in the mountains, cross rivers, navigate in the forest, and survive in extreme conditions. Exercises were conducted to practice various scenarios, repelling invasions, counterattacks, and offensive operations. The command of the Far Eastern Front changed several times in 1941-1942. Various military leaders succeeded one another in this post, solving the tasks of defense and training troops. But in April 1943, the High Command decided to appoint Colonel General Maksim Purkaev as commander of the front. This appointment was not accidental. An experienced military leader was needed who was capable not only of organizing a reliable defense, but also of preparing the troops for a future offensive. By the time Purkaev arrived, the situation in the Far East remained tense, but relatively stable. Japan was tied up in the war in the Pacific, where the Americans were launching a counteroffensive. However, the Kwantung Army remained powerful, and the threat of a surprise attack had not disappeared. The new commander had a tremendous amount of work ahead of him in analyzing the situation, strengthening defenses, and preparing plans for future operations. For 2.5 years, he would build the Far Eastern Front into a formidable force capable of defeating a long-standing enemy. What tasks did he face in this position? The Japanese Kwantung Army was one of the most powerful groups of the Japanese armed forces. Its history began in the early 20th century, when Japan gained a foothold in Manchuria after its victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. In 1931, Japan occupied all of Manchuria, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo. The Kwantung Army became the main military force in this territory, effectively controlling the region's politics and economy. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, the Kwantung Army numbered about 700,000 men. The army included infantry divisions, tank and cavalry units, artillery, aviation, engineering, and other special units. The The Japanese command viewed the Kwantung Army as a strategic reserve for waging war against the USSR or China. The troops were well trained, had combat experience from many years of war in China, and were equipped with modern weapons. Japanese military doctrine was based on the ideas of aggressive offense, swift attacks, and fanatical devotion to the emperor. Japanese soldiers were distinguished by their high discipline, steadfastness in defense, and willingness to sacrifice themselves. The samurai spirit, instilled from childhood, made them dangerous opponents. However, the Japanese army also had weaknesses. Insufficient technical equipment compared to European armies, tactics that were outdated in some respects, and an overestimation of the role of spiritual factors to the detriment of material ones. Japanese military planning with regard to the USSR was based on several scenarios. The main plan was codenamed Kwantung and envisaged an invasion of the Soviet Primary and Transbaikalia regions in the event of a favorable strategic situation. The main strike was planned from Manchuria in the direction of Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, with the aim of cutting off the Soviet Far East from the rest of the country and capturing ports and industrial centers. Auxiliary strikes were planned in Transbaikalia and on the border with Mongolia. To implement these plans, the Japanese created a powerful system of fortifications on Manchurian territory. Along the border with the USSR and Mongolia, fortified areas were built with concrete pillboxes, anti-tank ditches, and wire barriers. Particular attention was paid to fortifying the routes leading to Vladivostok and Khabarovsk. Supply bases, airfields, and hospitals were established deep in Manchuria. Railways and highways connected military facilities, ensuring the rapid transfer of troops. In the summer of 1941, when German troops dealt crushing blows to the Red Army, Tokyo seriously discussed entering the war against the USSR. The Kwantung Army conducted large-scale exercises, which were in fact a covert mobilization. Troops were put on alert, reservists were called up for service, and ammunition and equipment were brought to the border. In August 1941, the Japanese command planned to launch an invasion, counting on a quick defeat of the disorganized Soviet troops. However, their calculations did not come true. Despite heavy losses, the Red Army was not defeated. Soviet troops in the Far East remained highly combat-ready and demonstrated their readiness to repel aggression. Intelligence reported to the Japanese command about powerful fortifications on the border, the presence of tanks and artillery, and the fighting spirit of Soviet soldiers. Memories of the defeat at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, when Soviet troops under Zhukov's command defeated the Japanese group, dampened the enthusiasm of the militarists. Having decided to postpone the war with the USSR, the Japanese leadership directed its main efforts to the south. On December 7, 1941, the war in the Pacific began. Japanese troops attacked American, British, and Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. In a few months, Japan captured vast territories: the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and many islands. The Kwantung Army was partially weakened by the transfer of units to the south. However, Japan's strategic leadership did not abandon its plans for war with the USSR. Germany repeatedly called on its Japanese ally to attack the Soviet Far East in order to draw Red Army forces away from the Western Front. On May 15, 1942, German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop sent a telegram to the Japanese government emphasizing the effectiveness of the strategy of tying down Soviet Far Eastern troops. Even without an open invasion, the mere threat of attack forced the USSR to keep significant forces in the Far East that could have reinforced troops in the West. In the summer of 1942, when the Wehrmacht was advancing on Stalingrad and the Caucasus, the Kwantung Army was reinforced with additional divisions. The Japanese command monitored developments, ready to enter the war in the event of the collapse of the USSR. Provocations were carried out on the border, airspace violations, demonstrations of force. The Soviet leadership was well aware of the seriousness of the threat and did not relax its attention to the eastern borders. The situation began to change after the Battle of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-1943. The defeat of Paulus's German army showed that Germany was not only unable to defeat the USSR, but was itself on the brink of disaster. The Japanese leadership began to revise its strategic plans. In addition, the Americans launched an offensive in the Pacific, recapturing islands seized by the Japanese. Japan had to transfer troops to defend its positions in the south. Nevertheless, the Kwantung Army remained a formidable force. By the end of the war, its strength still exceeded 1 million men. The fortified areas in Manchuria were powerful, and the troops remained combat-ready. The Japanese command planned to use Manchuria as a last line of defense in case of an Allied invasion. The plan was to wage a protracted defensive war here, wearing down the enemy in difficult terrain. But the Soviet command was preparing a different scenario, a lightning offensive that would prevent the Japanese from organizing a staggered defense. How would the strike against the Kwantung Army be prepared? For General Maksim Purkaev, the 2.5 years of commanding the Far Eastern Front were a period of a special kind of war. A war without major battles, but with constant tension, provocations, and readiness at any moment to repel an invasion or go on the offensive themselves. It was an invisible war of intelligence, a border war of nerves, a diplomatic and psychological war. Every day, thousands of Soviet soldiers and officers stood on the border, ready to repel the aggressor. NKVD border troops served on the thousands of kilometers of border with Manchuria and Korea. Outposts replaced outposts, patrols followed patrols. Border guards watched the opposite banks of the Amur and Ussuri rivers, recorded the movements of Japanese troops, and prevented attempts to violate the border. The Japanese also conducted surveillance, provoked incidents, and tested the strength of Soviet defenses. There were regular skirmishes, arrests of violators, and protests through diplomatic channels. Reconnaissance units of the Far Eastern Front were actively gathering information about the enemy. Human intelligence had sources in Manchuria, Japan, and Korea. Intelligence officers reported on the deployment of Japanese troops, their numbers, armaments, command plans, and morale in the army. Aerial reconnaissance regularly flew along the border, photographing Japanese fortifications and military facilities. Radio intelligence intercepted Japanese radio communications, decrypted codes, and identified troop movements. All this information flowed to the front headquarters, where specialists analyzed the data, compiled reports, and assessed the enemy's intentions. Purkaev personally studied intelligence reports and delved into the details of the situation. He understood that the success of the future operation largely depended on the quality of intelligence. It was necessary to know not only where the Japanese troops were located, but also their combat capabilities, morale, and weak points in their defenses. Intelligence gave the command eyes and ears on enemy territory. The Japanese, for their part, also conducted active reconnaissance. Their agents tried to infiltrate Soviet territory, recruited local residents, and gathered information about the deployment of Soviet troops. Front counterintelligence and the NKVD fought against Japanese espionage, identified agents, and prevented sabotage. A special regime was in effect in the border areas. Civilians were not allowed to move freely, special passes were required, and suspicious individuals were monitored. Provocations at the border were regular. Japanese aircraft violated the airspace of the USSR, sometimes leading to air battles. Japanese ships entered Soviet territorial waters, provoking border patrol boats. Armed incidents occurred on the land border. Japanese soldiers fired on Soviet posts, attempted to capture high ground in disputed areas of the border, and kidnapped border guards. Each such incident could escalate into a serious confrontation, so it was necessary to show both firmness and restraint. The Front Command developed a system for responding to provocations. Reinforced garrisons were established in particularly dangerous sections of the border, ready to repel an attack immediately. Artillery was positioned where it could support the border guards. Tank units were ready to move out. Aircraft patrolled the border, ready to intercept intruders. But at the same time, the order was not to give in to provocations, not to give the Japanese any reason to accuse the USSR of aggression. In addition to defensive tasks, Purkaev was busy preparing troops for future offensive operations. He understood perfectly well that sooner or later the USSR would enter the war against Japan. The Allies in the anti-Hitler coalition, the US and Great Britain, insisted on this, counting on the Red Army's help in defeating Japan. The Soviet leadership agreed, but postponed entering the war until Germany was defeated. When that moment came, the Far Eastern Front had to be ready to immediately go on the offensive. Preparations were made in all areas. The troops underwent intensive combat training, mastered new techniques, and practiced inter-service cooperation. Particular attention was paid to the specifics of the theater of war: mountain training, river crossings, and operations in the taiga. Large-scale exercises were conducted involving all branches of the armed forces: infantry, tanks, artillery, aviation, and engineering units. The exercises focused on breaking through fortified areas, encircling the enemy, and rapid pursuit. Supplying the front was a difficult task. The Trans-Siberian Railway was operating at maximum capacity. Trains carrying Far Eastern resources and troops transferred for the war with Germany were heading west, while weapons, ammunition, and equipment were being transported east. The capacity of the railway was limited, so priorities had to be set. Purkaev sought to obtain the necessary resources from the High Command, explaining the importance of preparing for war with Japan. Gradually, stocks of ammunition, fuel, and food accumulated in the front's warehouses. Moral and political work was also of considerable importance. Soldiers and commanders had to understand the importance of their mission. While decisive battles were being fought in the West, the Far East stood on the border, preventing Japan from entering the war. This work was no less important than participating in the fighting. Political workers held talks, told about the course of the war in the West, about the atrocities of the Japanese militarists in China, about the need to be ready to defend the motherland. By the beginning of 1945, the Far Eastern Front, under Purkaev's command, was a powerful military force ready to carry out any combat mission. The troops were trained, equipped, and morally prepared for battle. the command developed detailed plans for offensive operations, taking into account the specifics of the theater, the strength of the enemy, and the tasks of defeating the Kwantung Army. All that remained was to wait for the order from the High Command. Once Germany was defeated, it would be Japan's turn. Was the front ready for decisive battles? At the end of 1943, the Supreme Command Headquarters set the Far Eastern Front Command a specific task: to study in detail the deployment and condition of the Japanese Kwantung Army and to develop plans for future offensive operations against Japan. This directive marked the beginning of systematic preparations for war in the East. Although the country's main forces were focused on the fight against Germany, the Soviet leadership looked ahead, understanding the inevitability of a clash with Japan. Colonel General Maksim Alexeyevich Purkaev organized the work of the headquarters to accomplish this task. Working groups were created to deal with various aspects of planning. The intelligence department collected and systematized data on the enemy. The operations department developed options for offensive operations. The rear services calculated the needs for material resources, transport, and medical supplies. All these areas of work required coordination and control by the commander. The Japanese Kwantung Army was studied in all directions. Intelligence reported on the number of troops. By the end of 1943, it was about 700,000–800,000 people. The deployment of divisions, their subordination, commanders, and combat strength were recorded. Fortified areas, their defense systems, and garrisons were identified. The armament of the Japanese troops was analyzed: types of tanks, artillery systems, and aircraft. The combat capabilities of the Japanese Army were assessed based on its actions in China and the Pacific. Particular attention was paid to the geography of the theater of war. Manchuria was a vast territory with a diverse landscape. In the west was the Greater Khingan Mountain Range, impassable, covered with forests, with few passes. In the east were the lowlands of the Sungari and Ussuri river valleys, swampy and flooded during the rainy season. In the center was relatively flat terrain, suitable for tank and mechanized troops. The climate was continental, with hot summers and cold winters. All of this had to be taken into account when planning operations. Staff officers studied possible directions of attack. Options were considered for an offensive through the Greater Khingan Mountains, along the Sungari River Valley, from Primary towards Harbin and Mukden. Each option had advantages and disadvantages. The mountain passes were difficult to traverse, but breaking through them would allow the troops to get behind Japanese defenses. An advance across the plains promised a fast pace of movement, but required overcoming heavily fortified areas. It was necessary to choose the optimal combination of main and secondary attack directions. Purkaev personally participated in reconnaissance of the terrain. He traveled to the border areas, inspected positions, studied roads, river crossings, and possible deployment lines for troops. The commander understood that the success of the operation largely depended on knowledge of the theater of war. It is impossible to plan an offensive while sitting at a desk with maps in front of you. You need to see the terrain with your own eyes, understand its features, and imagine how the troops will operate in real conditions. The most important task was to accumulate material resources. An offensive operation of this scale required a huge amount of ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies. All of this had to be delivered to the Far East via the Trans-Siberian Railway. Purkaev sent well-founded requests for resources to the High Command. Military railway workers increased the capacity of the railway, created additional passing loops, and repaired rolling stock. Train after train headed east, delivering military cargo. Millions of shells and mines, thousands of tons of fuel, and food supplies accumulated in the front's warehouses. Reserves were created in case of protracted hostilities. Medical services prepared hospitals, formed medical battalions, and stockpiled medicines and bandages. Engineering troops received pontoon parks for river crossings, mine and explosive equipment, and means for overcoming obstacles. Everything had to be ready for the start of the operation. Troops were trained with the specifics of the upcoming combat operations in mind. Infantry units practiced storming fortified areas, coordinating with tanks and artillery, and operating in mountainous and forested terrain. Tank crews learned to cross water obstacles, conduct long marches, and fight in populated areas. Artillerymen practiced breaking through enemy defenses with concentrated fire, supporting advancing infantry and tanks with a barrage of fire, and fighting enemy fortifications. Particular attention was paid to the interaction of different branches of the military. Modern warfare required the coordinated work of infantry, tanks, artillery, aviation, and engineering troops. Comprehensive exercises were conducted to practice the interaction of all these forces. Commanders at various levels learned to coordinate the actions of their units with neighboring units, maintain communication, and clearly carry out assigned tasks. Staffs trained in commanding troops in the dynamic environment of an offensive operation. The front's aviation forces also prepared for war. Pilots mastered new aircraft, studied tactics for action against Japanese aviation, practiced bombing ground targets, and assaulted enemy troops. New airfields were built in the border zone, and reserves of aviation fuel and ammunition were created. Reconnaissance aircraft systematically monitored Japanese positions, photographed fortifications, and identified troop concentrations. By mid-1944, the planning of operations was in its final stages. Several options for offensive actions were developed depending on the situation. The requirements for forces and resources were calculated, the directions of the main strikes were determined, and tasks were set for armies and corps. The plans were agreed upon with the General Staff and adjusted to take into account their comments. Purkaev reported that the front was ready to carry out combat missions. In October 1944, Colonel General Purkaev received the high military rank of General of the Army. This was recognition of his merits in training troops and his contribution to the future victory. Only a few dozen senior commanders of the Red Army held the rank of General of the Army. For Purkaev, this was a triumph after the bitterness of his removal from command of the Kalinin Front. He proved his ability to solve the most difficult tasks and justified the trust of the High Command. By the beginning of 1945, the Far Eastern Front was ready for an offensive. The troops were trained, material reserves were created, and plans were developed. All that remained was to wait for the High Command's order. This order depended on the end of the war in Europe. The USSR promised its allies that it would enter the war against Japan 2 to 3 months after Germany's surrender. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The time had come. How would events unfold in the Far East? On August 5, 1945, an important organizational restructuring of Soviet troops in the Far East took place. The Far Eastern Front was divided into two fronts, the First and Second Far Eastern Fronts. Army General Maksim Alexeyevich Purkaev was appointed commander of the Second Far Eastern Front. This division was dictated by the scale of the upcoming operation. The offensive was carried out over a huge area, from Transbaikalia to the Pacific Ocean, and it was impossible to command all the troops from a single headquarters. The Second Far Eastern Front was tasked with advancing in a strip from the middle reaches of the Amur River to the coast of the Sea of Japan. The front consisted of the 15th and 2nd Red Banner Armies, the 5th Separate Army, reinforced with tank, artillery, and aviation units. The Amur Military Flotilla was operationally subordinate to the front and was to assist in the crossing of the Amur and Sungari rivers. Purkaev's troops were opposed by the Japanese Third Front Army, numbering about 200,000 men, which occupied fortified positions on the eastern banks of the Amur and Ussuri rivers. On August 8th, at 23:00 Moscow time, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. This statement was made after Japan rejected the Potsdam Declaration of the Allies, demanding unconditional surrender. The USSR fulfilled its allied obligations to the United States and Great Britain, promising to enter the war against Japan after the defeat of Germany. Diplomatic norms were observed. The Japanese ambassador in Moscow was handed a note declaring war. An hour later, the invasion began. At 1 a.m. local time on August 9th, troops from 3 Soviet fronts, the Transbaikal, 1st and 2nd Far Eastern, simultaneously crossed the border. The Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation began, one of the largest operations of World War II. More than 1.5 million Soviet soldiers and officers, supported by thousands of tanks, guns, and aircraft, descended on the positions of the Kwantung Army. The strategy was to deliver powerful blows from several directions, encircle and dismember the Japanese troops, and quickly advance deep into Manchuria. The troops of the Second Far Eastern Front, under the command of Purkaev, began the operation by crossing the Amur River. It was an extremely difficult task. The Amur was 1.5 to 2 kilometers wide in this area. The current was fast, and the Japanese had fortified positions on the opposite bank. Artillery preparation began at 1 o'clock in the morning. Thousands of guns opened fire on Japanese positions. Under the cover of artillery, engineering units began to set up crossings, and assault groups on boats and rafts rushed to the opposite bank. The Amur Military Flotilla actively assisted in the crossing. Armored boats suppressed enemy firing points, landed troops on the Japanese shore, and covered the crossing troops. The Japanese put up stubborn resistance, but were overwhelmed by the power of Soviet fire. By the morning of August 9th, the first Soviet units had secured the eastern bank, expanding their bridgeheads. Pontoon bridges allowed heavy equipment, tanks, and artillery to begin crossing. At the same time, further south, in the area where the Ussuri flows into the Amur, troops of the 5th Separate Army also crossed the river and began advancing deep into enemy territory. The Japanese command did not expect such a rapid and powerful strike. The defense was broken in several places, and Soviet troops rushed forward. The pace of the offensive was impressive, 30 to 40 kilometers per day, despite enemy resistance and the difficult terrain. The Japanese tried to organize counterattacks and delay the advance at intermediate lines, but Soviet troops bypassed pockets of resistance and surrounded Japanese garrisons, preventing them from gaining a foothold. The front's air force bombed Japanese fortifications, railway junctions, troop concentrations, and airfields. Air superiority was seized from the first days of the operation. Soviet pilots destroyed Japanese aircraft, both in air battles and at airfields. Purkaev directed the operation from the front headquarters, maintaining constant contact with army commanders, coordinating their actions and making operational decisions. The situation was changing rapidly. The Japanese were retreating but did not surrender, continuing to resist. In some places, fierce battles broke out, with Japanese soldiers fighting to the last, following the samurai code. However, the overall picture was clear. The enemy's defenses were collapsing, and the offensive was progressing successfully. By mid-August, the troops of the Second Far Eastern Front had advanced to 150-200 kilometers and liberated vast territories of northern Manchuria. Several Japanese divisions were destroyed, large trophies were captured, and thousands of prisoners were taken. The Japanese Third Front Army effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. Some of its units retreated south, trying to break out of the encirclement, but Soviet troops pursued them, preventing them from gaining a foothold. On August 9th, a second American atomic bomb exploded in the sky over the Japanese city of Nagasaki. 3 days earlier, a similar bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. The combination of atomic strikes and the Soviet Union's entry into the war broke the Japanese leadership's will to resist. On August 15th, the Emperor of Japan addressed the nation on the radio, announcing his decision to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Japan surrendered. However, for the Kwantung Army, the war was not over yet. What tasks would Purkaev's front accomplish? The main operation of the Second Far Eastern Front, under the command of Army General Maksim Purkaev, was the Sungari Offensive. It was carried out from August 9th to 20, 1945, in the northeastern part of Manchuria, in the Sungari River Basin. The aim of the operation was to defeat the Japanese Third Front Army, liberate vast territories, and join forces with the Trans-Baikal Front, advancing from the west, and the First Far Eastern Front, advancing from the east. The operation unfolded in 2 stages. In the first stage, from August 9 to 14, the troops crossed the Amur and Ussuri rivers, broke through the Japanese border defenses, and advanced deep into enemy territory. The second stage, from August 15 to 20, was characterized by a rapid advance towards Sungari. The liberation of the cities of Fugdin, Jiamusi, Fuyuan, and Tongjiang, and the encirclement and destruction of the remaining Japanese troops. The total depth of the operation was 200 kilometers, and the pace of the offensive was up to 40 kilometers per day. A distinctive feature of the Sungari operation was the interaction between the land forces and the Amur military flotilla. The flotilla included armored boats, mine layers, landing craft, and transports. The sailors not only ensured the crossing of troops across rivers, but also acted independently, landing troops behind enemy lines, capturing river ports, and blocking the Japanese retreat routes. The commander of the flotilla, Rear Admiral Nikolai Antonov, worked closely with the front headquarters, coordinating the flotilla's actions with the advance of the ground forces. One of the most memorable moments of the operation was the storming of the city of Sungari, a major river port and communications hub. The Japanese garrison had fortified the city, turning it into a stronghold. The approaches were covered with minefields and barbed wire barriers. Soviet troops approached the city on August 13th. Artillery preparation began, after which the infantry and tanks launched an assault. Fighting in the city continued for a day. The Japanese fought stubbornly, but were defeated. The city was liberated on August 14th. The capture of Jiamusi, one of the largest cities in northern Manchuria, was an important success for the front. The city was located on the banks of the Songhua River and was a major industrial and transportation center. The Japanese planned to hold it at all costs, concentrating a significant garrison there. But the Soviet troops acted swiftly. The advance units bypassed the city from the flanks, cutting off the retreat routes. On August 19th, the assault began. The street fighting was fierce, but by the evening of August 20th, the city was completely liberated. Tank and mechanized units played a special role in the operation. They rushed forward, bypassing pockets of resistance, cutting off enemy communications, and capturing crossings and important points. The Japanese infantry could not withstand the rapid strikes of Soviet tanks. The Japanese anti-tank artillery was weaker than the Soviet, and their outdated tanks could not compete with the T-34s. Tank crews made raids deep into enemy defenses, sowing panic and disorganization. The front's air force operated with maximum intensity. Bombers struck Japanese airfields, railway junctions, warehouses, and headquarters. Stormtroopers supported the advancing troops, destroying enemy firing points, equipment, and manpower. Fighters dominated the air, shooting down the few Japanese aircraft. During the operation, the Air Force made thousands of combat sorties and destroyed hundreds of targets on the ground and in the air. Despite Japan's announcement of surrender on August 15th, the Kwantung Army continued to resist. The Japanese command did not order its troops to lay down their arms. Individual units and garrisons continued to fight, either unaware of the surrender or unwilling to obey the imperial decree. Soviet troops had to storm fortified positions and destroy stubbornly resisting garrisons. Only by August 19th to 20 did the resistance begin to weaken. By the end of the operation, the troops of the Second Far Eastern Front had liberated an area of about 300,000 square kilometers. 6 Japanese divisions and several separate brigades were destroyed. More than 50,000 prisoners were captured, along with a huge amount of weapons and military equipment. Soviet losses amounted to about 7,000 killed and more than 13,000 wounded. The ratio of losses testified to the high level of training of the Soviet troops and the skillful leadership of the operation. The success of the Sungari Operation was due to several factors. The thorough preparation that Purkaev had been conducting for more than 2 years bore fruit. The troops were trained, well-equipped, and morally ready. The suddenness and power of the first strike stunned the enemy. Clear interaction between the branches of the armed forces, coordination with the fleet, and the massive use of aviation ensured the rapid development of the offensive. The high pace of the operation did not allow the Japanese to organize a staggered defense and bring their reserves into action. Purkaev personally directed the operation, making decisions based on constantly incoming information. He adjusted plans in accordance with changes in the situation, directed reserves to threatened areas, and encouraged successfully operating units. The front headquarters worked clearly and cohesively, ensuring continuous command of the troops. Communication with the armies was maintained through all channels: radio, wire, and liaison officers. The general proved himself a master of operational art, capable of planning and conducting large-scale offensive operations. But the war in the Far East was not over yet. What tasks did the front have to accomplish next? On August 22, 1945, the Supreme Command Headquarters set a new task for the Second Far Eastern Front: to conduct the South Sakhalin offensive operation with the aim of liberating the southern part of Sakhalin Island from Japanese occupation. Southern Sakhalin had been under Japanese control since 1905, after Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. The return of this territory was not only of military, but also of historical significance. Historical justice was being restored. The Japanese had built a powerful defense on South Sakhalin. The narrow isthmus near the 50th parallel, which separated the Soviet and Japanese parts of the island, was turned into a fortified area. It was equipped with concrete pillboxes and bunkers, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and wire barriers. The garrison consisted of about 20 to 30,000 men. The Japanese command hoped to hold the defense and repel possible attacks by Soviet troops. On August 11th, even before the end of the Sungari Operation, Soviet troops on Sakhalin went on the offensive. The 16th Army, part of the front, attacked Japanese fortifications on the isthmus. Heavy fighting ensued. The Japanese put up fierce resistance, using advantageous positions and powerful fortifications. The offensive progressed slowly. Soviet units suffered losses as they fought their way through the defenses meter by meter. Artillery destroyed pillboxes, sappers cleared passages through minefields, and infantry stormed the trenches. By August 15th, the defenses had been breached in some areas. Soviet troops wedged themselves into the Japanese defenses, widening the breach. The Japanese command threw reserves into counterattacks in an attempt to restore the situation. Fierce counterattacks ensued. However, Soviet troops had superiority in artillery and tanks, which gradually tipped the scales in their favor. By August 20th, resistance began to weaken as news of Japan's surrender reached the Japanese troops. On August 25th, Soviet troops occupied the largest city in South Sakhalin, Toyoharu, now Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk. The Japanese garrison did not offer serious resistance. The city was liberated almost without a fight. Soviet units continued their advance southward toward the port cities of Maoki and Otomari. The Japanese garrisons in these cities surrendered without resistance. By the end of August, all of South Sakhalin had been liberated. The island became Russian territory again after 40 years of Japanese occupation. Simultaneously with the Sakhalin Operation, the Second Far Eastern Front participated in the Kuril landing operation. The Kuril Islands, stretching in a chain from Kamchatka to Hokkaido, were also under Japanese control. The High Command set the task of liberating these islands, ensuring the security of the Soviet coast and the bases of the Pacific Fleet. The operation was carried out by the forces of the Northern Pacific Flotilla, with the participation of troops from the Kamchatka Defense District. On August 18th, a landing force was disembarked on Shumshu Island, the northernmost of the Kuril Islands. The Japanese garrison put up fierce resistance. Heavy fighting ensued. Soviet Marines secured a foothold, repelled counterattacks, and expanded the captured territory. The fighting continued until August 23rd, when the Japanese commander received an order to surrender. The island was taken under control. The losses on both sides were significant, testifying to the tenacity of the Japanese and the courage of the Soviet sailors and soldiers. After capturing Shumshu, Soviet troops successively landed on other islands of the Kuril Ridge. On August 28th, Paramushir Island was captured, and on September 1st, the islands of Onegotan and Shikotan. The Japanese garrisons surrendered without a fight, realizing the futility of resistance after the capitulation of the metropolis. By September 5th, the entire Kuril Islands were under Soviet control. The operation was a complete success. The liberation of South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands was of great strategic importance. Territories lost after the Russo-Japanese War were returned. The security of the Soviet Far East was ensured, and Japanese military bases off the coast of the USSR were eliminated. The ports of South Sakhalin opened up new opportunities for the Soviet fishing and merchant fleets. The Kuril Islands became an outpost of defense in the Pacific Ocean. For Army General Purkaev, the completion of operations on Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands was the final chord of his military career. The Second Far Eastern Front, under his command, accomplished all of its objectives. The Japanese Third Front Army in Manchuria was defeated. Vast territories were liberated, and South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands were returned. The war ended in victory. For his skillful leadership of the troops in operations against Japan, Purkaev was awarded the Order of Suvorov, First Class. On September 2, 1945, aboard the American battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, a ceremony was held to sign the Act of Unconditional Surrender of Japan. World War II officially ended. For the Soviet Union, it was a complete and final victory over all its enemies. From the western borders to the Far East, Soviet soldiers proved their valor and courage. Commanders and generals, such as Purkaev, demonstrated high military skill. The country paid a huge price for victory, but defended its right to exist and its freedom. What awaited the general in the post-war years? The victory over Japan ended Army General Maksim Purkaev's combat activities, but did not end his military service. On October 1, 1945, the Second Far Eastern Front was disbanded, and Purkaev was appointed commander of the Far Eastern Military District. This position was one of the most responsible in the Soviet armed forces. The district commander was responsible for the defense of a huge region, commanded hundreds of thousands of military personnel, and coordinated interaction with the Navy and border troops. The post-war Far East required special attention. Although Japan had been defeated and occupied by the Allies, the situation in Asia remained unstable. A civil war was unfolding in China between the Communists and the Kuomintang government. Two opposing states were forming on the Korean peninsula. The Soviet Union had strategic interests in this region and had to be prepared for any turn of events. The troops of the Far Eastern District ensured the security of the borders and the Soviet presence in the region. Purkaev was involved in transferring troops to peacetime status. Demobilization affected millions of military personnel throughout the country. Soldiers and officers who had fought in the war returned to civilian life. The troops were reduced in size, but had to remain combat-ready. It was necessary to organize the training of new recruits, maintain the combat readiness of units, and monitor material supplies. At the same time, the troops helped to rebuild the region's war-torn economy by building roads, bridges, and housing. A special task was the organization of the Soviet military administration in South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. These territories had to be integrated into the USSR, governed, and their economic life had to be established. From October 1945, Purkaev headed the military administration of Karafuto, as the Japanese called South Sakhalin. Under his leadership, the Japanese population was repatriated, infrastructure was restored, and the resettlement of Soviet citizens to the liberated territories was organized. In January 1947, Purkaev was relieved of his duties as commander of the district's troops and placed at the disposal of the Minister of the Armed Forces of the USSR. This could have meant either preparation for a new appointment or actual removal from active service. However, in June of the same year, he received a new important appointment as Chief of Staff and First Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Far East Forces. This was a high-ranking staff position that involved coordinating the actions of all troops in the Far East. Purkaev held this position until July 1952. He was involved in planning the defense of the Far Eastern borders, interacting with the Pacific Fleet, and training troops. The international situation in Asia remained complex. The Korean War of 1950–1953 showed that the threat of military conflict in the region remained. The Soviet Union supported North Korea and China, but did not enter into open war with the United States. The Far Eastern troops had to be ready for any developments. In July 1952, Army General Purkaev was transferred to Moscow and appointed head of the Department of Higher Military Educational Institutions of the USSR Ministry of Defense. It was an administrative position related to the management of military education. Purkaev was responsible for training officers at military academies and schools. His rich combat and staff experience was in demand in the training of future commanders. However, age took its toll. In 1952, he turned 58. On January 1, 1953, Army General Maksim Alexeyevich Purkaev died in Moscow. He was 58 years old. The cause of death was illness, probably related to the stress of the war years. His life was cut short on the threshold of a new year that symbolized a peaceful future for the country, for which he had fought his entire adult life. The general's funeral was held with military honors. He was buried at the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, a necropolis where many prominent Russian figures have found their final resting place. Purkaev left a significant mark on the history of the Soviet armed forces. From a simple soldier in World War I to an army general and front commander, such was his path. He fought in 3 wars: World War I, the Civil War, and the Great Patriotic War. He participated in the defense of Ukraine, the Battle of Moscow, the Rzhev battles, and the war with Japan. He commanded an army, a front, and a military district. His name is inscribed in the history of the defeat of the Kwantung Army and the liberation of South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. The memory of the general lives on in street names, monuments, and the memories of his fellow soldiers. In 1966, the village of Nalito in Mordovia, where he was born, was renamed Purkaevo. Streets in Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, Saransk, and other cities are named after him. A memorial plaque in honor of the general has been installed on Sakhalin. Military historians study his operations, analyze his decisions, and evaluate his contribution to victory. Purkaev's life is an example of service to the motherland, dedication to duty, and the ability to overcome difficulties. He found himself in difficult situations twice. His removal from command of the Kalinin Front could have ended his career, but he proved his worth in his new position. Not every military leader is capable of withstanding such trials and continuing to serve with full dedication. Purkaev endured, justified the trust placed in him, and made a significant contribution to the victory over Japan. History has preserved the name of Army General Maksim Alexeyevich Purkaev as one of the talented Soviet military leaders, defender of the Far Eastern borders, and liberator of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. His fate is part of the great history of a people who defended their independence in the most terrible war of the 20th century. Generations who grew up in peacetime have a duty to remember those who sacrificed their lives to ensure their peaceful future.